Rudolf Hess had been deputy leader of Nazi Germany, only one place behind Adolf Hitler. World War I infantryman and pilot, had been complicit in all the actions taken by the Nazis against its enemies.
A 93-year-old man found dead in a garden shed, an electrical cord wrapped around his neck. Case closed, right? Except the man was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, the second most powerful Nazi in the world. And for 46 years, he had been the most guarded prisoner on Earth. Not because of what he had done, but because of what he knew. In 2025, classified documents finally cracked open, and what they revealed didn't just rewrite one man's death. They exposed a web of aristocratic betrayal, royal connections, and a coordinated cover-up that stretched from Buckingham Palace to Berlin. 4 nations guarded him. 40 guards watched his every move. Yet somehow, a frail old man who could barely lift his arms managed to hang himself without anyone noticing. Or did he? The official story says suicide, but the evidence tells a very different tale. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why governments on both sides of the Atlantic spent 8 decades making sure this man never spoke. Stay with me, because the truth behind Rudolf Hess's flight, imprisonment, and death will give you goosebumps. The year was 1941. Europe was on fire. Cities were crumbling under German bombs. Millions of soldiers were dying on battlefields from France to the Soviet frontier. London itself had just endured 3 straight days of the heaviest bombing of the entire war. The House of Commons was literally in flames from German incendiary bombs. And in the middle of all this chaos, one of Hitler's most trusted men did something so bizarre that even his closest allies thought he had lost his mind. Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, climbed into a modified Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighter plane and flew solo into enemy territory. No escort, no backup, no permission. Just one man, flying 1,000 miles across the North Sea, straight into the heart of Britain during the deadliest war in human history. At the exact moment when British hatred for Germany was at its peak. Now here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't some impulsive decision made in a moment of panic. Hess had been planning this for months. Starting in late 1940, he underwent secret flight training at hidden airfields away from prying eyes. He wasn't just brushing up on old skills. He was training specifically for this one mission. He had the plane modified with extended fuel tanks so it could make the journey without stopping. He installed a special radio compass to help him navigate across the treacherous North Sea. He studied British coastal geography, memorized navigation routes, and rehearsed the entire flight path down to the last detail. Each evening, under the guise of military oversight, he practiced air routes and refined his navigation by compass alone. He knew exactly where the British radar stations were. He knew the patrol patterns of RAF fighters. He even calculated the precise time of sunset to ensure he would arrive under cover of darkness. These were not the actions of a madman. These were the blueprints of someone following a carefully calculated mission. On May 10th, 1941, just as the sun was setting, Hess took off from Augsburg Airfield. He flew north over Denmark, then turned west across the sea. British radar picked him up almost immediately. They tracked his signal. They scrambled Spitfires to intercept. Anti-aircraft batteries radioed for permission to open fire. And then something strange happened. Permission was denied. For nearly 5 hours, Hess flew unchallenged through British airspace. No bullets, no resistance, nothing. Some historians later suggested he was given an aerial corridor, which would have been impossible unless someone on the British side was expecting him. When his fuel ran out near Scotland, Hess parachuted into the night sky and landed on a farm outside Glasgow. He injured his ankle on impact and lay in a field until a local farmer named David McLean found him limping through the darkness. Now imagine being that farmer. It's nearly midnight. You hear a plane crash in the distance, and then some stranger in a flight suit emerges from your field speaking perfect English. The first words out of Hess's mouth were chilling. He said he was Captain Alfred Horn, and he needed to meet the Duke of Hamilton immediately. Not a government official, not a military commander, not anyone in Churchill's war cabinet. A duke, a British aristocrat he had never even met in person. Why him? Of all the people in Britain, why was Hess so desperate to reach this one specific man? The connection traced back to Hess's mentor, Professor Karl Haushofer, who had met the Duke during the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Haushofer had described Hamilton as sympathetic to peace between Germany and Britain, and Hess never forgot that. Within hours, British authorities realized exactly who they had captured. The world's second most powerful Nazi had just fallen into their hands without a single shot being fired. But instead of celebrating, something else happened. Silence. No press conferences, no photographs, no triumphant announcements. Hess simply vanished from the public eye, and the British government's next move would reveal just how terrified they really were. When Winston Churchill received word that Rudolf Hess had landed in Scotland, witnesses said his reaction was ice cold. No celebration, no patriotic speech, just an immediate order. Absolute secrecy. Hess was quietly transferred from the local police, who found him into military custody. From there, he was taken to Buchanan Castle, an isolated estate far from prying eyes. And within hours, the very man Hess had asked for showed up, the Duke of Hamilton. That first meeting between the two men remains one of history's best-guarded conversations. Hamilton later described it as brief and without consequence. But that account never satisfied historians who studied the event, because what Hess reportedly told him would have been political dynamite. According to multiple sources, Hess claimed he was carrying a personal message from Hitler himself. The proposal was simple. Britain would keep its empire, Germany would dominate continental Europe, and together they would contain the Soviet Union. But here's the part that made Churchill panic. Hess didn't just present a peace offer. He claimed that factions within Britain's own ruling class already supported the deal. Men who could persuade Churchill to agree if approached correctly. And if that claim had even a shred of truth, it meant members of Britain's elite had been communicating with the enemy before the war even started. Now, this wasn't as far-fetched as it sounds. You see, in the 1930s, there was a group in Britain called the Appeasers. These were wealthy aristocrats, politicians, and even members of the royal family who believed that Nazi Germany wasn't the real enemy. To them, communism was the bigger threat. Stalin's Soviet Union was expanding, and they figured that if Britain aligned with Hitler, they could stop the communist tide from sweeping across Europe. Some of these people had openly expressed sympathy for fascism. Others had attended parties and exclusive gatherings where German diplomats were entertained with champagne and polite conversation about the future of Europe. In the gilded drawing rooms of Britain's most prestigious estates, certain noble families debated how to broker peace on Hitler's terms. They believed that Nazism, while ugly, was a necessary wall against a worse fate. And Hitler knew it. He counted on these sympathies. And then there was the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII, who had abdicated in 1936, had visited Hitler personally. He had toured Nazi Germany as Hitler's guest. He had been photographed giving the Nazi salute at gatherings. And declassified MI5 files now confirm that British intelligence considered him a potential security threat during the war. Churchill himself had him shipped off to the Bahamas just to keep him away from any possible German contact. So when Hess parachuted into Scotland, claiming he had contacts among the British elite, he wasn't making things up. He had names, he had details, and that's exactly what made him so dangerous. Churchill had a choice to make. He could put Hess on trial and risk exposing aristocratic sympathizers who had been quietly whispering with the enemy. Or he could bury the whole thing. He chose burial. Hess was assigned to Major Frank Foley, one of MI6's most skilled interrogators. Foley was no ordinary officer. Before the war, he had smuggled thousands of Jews out of Germany using his position as a passport control officer. He understood Nazi psychology better than almost anyone in British intelligence. For over a year, Foley questioned Hess, documenting every statement and cross-referencing every claim. He met with him regularly, extracting intelligence piece by piece. But those reports were sealed away. No transcripts were released to the public. No official announcements were made. At the same time, Churchill assembled his closest advisors for a series of unrecorded meetings at Ditchley Park, far from London. There were no minutes, no notes, just whispers of what was discussed behind closed doors. Instead of acknowledging what Hess had revealed, the British government crafted a very different narrative. They told the world that Hess was mentally unstable, a delusional man who had flown into enemy territory on a meaningless mission driven by madness. But if that were true, why did they treat him like a diplomatic guest instead of a prisoner of war? Why were his files locked away for over 80 years? And why, according to documents released in 2025, did someone start medicating him into confusion? Shortly after Hess was captured, British psychiatrists examined him and delivered a convenient diagnosis. They said he was suffering from paranoid delusions, possible amnesia, and extreme hypochondria. In other words, he was crazy. His mission was meaningless, and nothing he said should be taken seriously. The timing of this diagnosis was awfully convenient. It gave the British government exactly what they needed, a way to dismiss everything Hess claimed without having to address whether any of it was true. But here's where things start to unravel. Despite being labeled mentally unstable, Hess wasn't sent to a psychiatric facility. He was kept in military custody at Maindif Court Hospital under armed guard, and MI6 continued interrogating him for intelligence. Not for treatment, not for his well-being, for information. If he was truly insane, why were they still extracting information from him? The early letters Hess wrote from captivity were precise and detailed, filled with political observations and coherent arguments. But over time, something changed. His writing became disjointed. He started claiming that invisible agents were trying to poison him. He reported conspiracies and hallucinations. Now, here's the twist. Declassified documents from 2025 revealed that Hess received frequent injections during his time in British custody. The contents were never officially disclosed, but one leaked report referenced experimental sedatives administered under wartime exemptions. Was Hess losing his mind naturally, or was someone helping that process along? His paranoid claims of being poisoned suddenly seem a lot less paranoid if someone actually was drugging him. Beyond chemical interference, psychological tactics were used to isolate him completely. Guards were instructed to minimize conversation. His access to news was restricted. Correspondence was heavily censored. Every visitor was scrutinized. His entire environment was designed to suppress his memory and prevent outside influence. In 1942, Hess tried to end his own life by throwing himself over a banister. He survived, but broke his leg badly. He would attempt it again the following year. Some historians believe these were signs of genuine mental collapse, but others argue that Hess had simply realized the truth. He had been used, trapped, and silenced, and there was no way out. By the mid-1940s, Hess had become a shadow of himself, physically present but mentally fragmented. The perfect cover story. A man too incoherent to be believed, too broken to expose the secrets he carried. And when the war ended, they shipped him off to a place where he would spend the next 4 decades in complete isolation. Spandau prison in West Berlin was built to hold 600 inmates. By 1966, it held exactly one, Rudolf Hess. Think about that for a moment. A massive 19th century fortress, hundreds of empty cells, corridors designed for crowds, and one elderly man shuffling through the silence. For over 40 years, he lived alone in that massive fortress, watched around the clock by 40 guards operating in rotating shifts. 4 nations took turns overseeing his imprisonment: the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Each country had 1 month of control before rotating to the next. The annual cost to keep one elderly man locked up was staggering. Millions of dollars spent maintaining a prison designed for hundreds, all for a single prisoner who posed no physical threat to anyone. He spent his days gardening in the prison courtyard, reading books, and writing letters to his family. Letters that were heavily censored before they ever left the building. So why wasn't he released? Other Nazi war criminals had served their sentences and walked free. Albert Speer got 20 years and left. But Hess, who had flown to Britain in 1941 before most of the Holocaust's worst atrocities were even planned, was never let go. His official crime was conspiracy and crimes against peace. And yet, he served longer than almost anyone. 3 of the 4 Allied powers eventually favored releasing him, but the Soviets consistently refused. Their official reason was that justice must be served. But unofficially, Spandau gave Russia something valuable: a legitimate foothold in West Berlin during the Cold War. And there's another theory. The Soviets also had questions about what Hess knew, and they weren't the only ones. As the decades passed, strange rumors began to circulate. Some guards who worked at Spandau noticed inconsistencies in Hess's appearance over the years. Medical records conflicted over his height, weight, and previous injuries. Here's the strangest part. Hess reportedly had a chest wound scar from World War I, a visible mark from shrapnel that should have been obvious to any doctor who examined him. But British doctors who looked at him in the 1940s made no mention of it whatsoever. Was the man behind those bars the real Rudolf Hess? Or had something happened to the original, with a double put in his place to maintain the illusion? It sounds like conspiracy fiction. But in 2025, a retired British intelligence officer's posthumous memoir revealed that serious doubts about Hess's identity had been raised internally within MI6 as early as 1943. The Soviets apparently expressed similar concerns about whether the prisoner was the genuine deputy Führer or merely a convenient stand-in. Whether or not the body double theory holds water, one fact is undeniable. By the 1980s, keeping Hess imprisoned served no legal or moral purpose. By the 1980s, pressure to release him was mounting. Human rights advocates argued that keeping a 90-year-old man in solitary confinement was barbaric. His son Wolf fought tirelessly for his freedom. Even some former guards publicly called for his release. But certain people didn't want Hess freed. They wanted him silenced. In the days before his death, Wolf visited his father at Spandau. According to Wolf, his father seemed weak but mentally alert. And then Hess said something that would haunt his son forever. He told him that they were going to kill him. 3 days later, Rudolf Hess was dead. On August 17, 1987, guards at Spandau prison found Rudolf Hess in a small garden shed. An electrical cord was wrapped around his neck. He was slumped against the wall, unresponsive. The official verdict came quickly. Suicide, case closed. Except nothing about that death made sense. Hess was 93 years old. He was arthritic, nearly blind, and so weak he could barely lift his arms above his shoulders. His hands shook constantly. He needed help getting dressed in the morning. Yet somehow, he had managed to loop an electrical cord over a window latch that was above his reach, tie it around his neck, and hang himself without anyone noticing in a prison with 40 guards, under 24-hour surveillance, with someone always supposed to be watching. The physical evidence raised even more questions. Bruises were found on his wrists and torso, marks that suggested restraint or struggle. The pattern was inconsistent with what you would expect from a self-inflicted hanging. The shed door had been locked from the outside, which made absolutely no sense if Hess had been alone when he died. Guards reported seeing unfamiliar personnel near the garden shed shortly before the body was discovered. Items were quickly cleared from the scene. Medical staff arrived within minutes, performing what some witnesses later described as a cleanup rather than an investigation. His son Wolf refused to accept the official verdict. He demanded an independent autopsy, which was conducted at Munich University. The findings contradicted the British report. The pathologist found evidence suggesting strangulation rather than self-hanging, but by then, key evidence had mysteriously disappeared. For decades, that's where the story ended. Whispers and suspicions, but no proof. Then came 2025. An anonymous source uploaded a cache of classified documents to a military historian's archive using heavy encryption. It took weeks to verify their authenticity through forensic linguistics analysis and metadata tracing. But the documents were real. They were marked Black Garden, Eyes Only, and what they contained sent shockwaves through the historical community. The files finally confirmed what researchers had suspected for decades. The documents revealed that Hess's flight to Scotland hadn't been a rogue mission at all. He had been carrying messages on behalf of clandestine intermediaries. British aristocrats had met with Nazi diplomats in neutral Portugal before the war. They had discussed terms for peace. Britain would keep its empire. Germany would get a free hand in continental Europe. They had offered to facilitate contacts that could bypass Churchill and the elected government entirely. And Hess knew all of it. Names, dates, meeting locations, the whole network. The files contained correspondence between members of the British elite and German officials. They included coded instructions and meeting minutes. Some names were redacted, but enough slipped through to reveal connections stretching into Parliament, military intelligence, and even circles close to the monarchy. Perhaps most damning was an MI6 memo from 1987, just months before Hess died. It stated that containment must be absolute and that exposure could not be permitted at that stage. Hess's release had been flagged as a potential threat to political stability. And then, conveniently, he died. The timing was no coincidence. For 46 years, Rudolf Hess had been kept alive but silenced. His knowledge was too dangerous to release, but executing him would have raised too many questions, so they kept him locked away, waiting. And when the pressure to free him became too great, someone made sure he never spoke. Rudolf Hess was many things: a loyal Nazi, a believer in a monstrous ideology, a man complicit in policies that destroyed millions of lives. He helped shape the racial laws that targeted Jewish people across Germany. He was a true believer who stood at Hitler's side during the darkest chapter of human history. But he was also something else: a witness, a carrier of secrets that powerful people on both sides of the war wanted buried forever. His flight wasn't madness, it was a mission. His imprisonment wasn't just punishment, it was containment. And his death wasn't suicide, it was silencing. The 2025 documents didn't just expose what happened to one man. They revealed that the history we thought we knew had been carefully edited, that aristocrats whispered with the enemy, that governments on both sides coordinated a cover-up lasting 8 decades, and that one man's knowledge was considered more dangerous than the crimes he had actually committed. For 46 years, Rudolf Hess sat in that prison, not because justice demanded it, but because his silence was required. And when he finally seemed close to freedom, close to the possibility of telling what he knew, that silence became permanent. 4 nations guarded him. 40 guards watched him. Yet somehow, he died alone in a garden shed with no witnesses. Make of that what you will. What do you think really happened in that garden shed? Was it really suicide? Or was Rudolf Hess the victim of something far more sinister? Drop your theory in the comments. And if this story gave you chills, share it with someone who still trusts the history books. Because some secrets don't stay buried forever. And sometimes, the truth is stranger than anything we could have imagined.